just as Jesus told them to. The Lord needs it.
And the owners let them go.
The disciples placed their cloaks on the colt, and then they placed Jesus on the colt.
And they begin to move toward Jerusalem.
It starts out in silence, just the plop plop of the colt.
And then folks notice this procession.
Perhaps they ask, "What's going on? What is this?"
And then they see Jesus, and they remember.
They remember the healings and the miracles they have seen.
Word spreads, and the crowds begin to gather.
Hosanna!
Hosanna! Blessed is the King who comes in the name of our God.
It is a full-on parade by this point.
Praising,
Shouting,
Hosanna!
It gets louder as they near Jerusalem.
And the Pharisees wake up.
Shh! You better be quiet.
Do you know what you're doing?
Have you forgotten where you are?
Shh! Rome will hear you.
Jesus, we're warning you. You better shut this down.
without missing a beat, Jesus motions to the crowds and then to the stones along the road and says, "If they keep quiet, these stones will cry out."
All the excitement, the joy, the pent-up longing for freedom.
if you could somehow silence this crowd, even the stones will shout.
Even the stones will shout.
But stones can't shout, can they?
But if they could, what would they shout?
Would they shout Hosanna?
Would the stones join in praise and celebration?
Remembering the history of Israel, would the stones see this as a saving moment?
Would they recall the words of Zechariah, the prophet who told the daughters of Jerusalem that their king would come gentle and riding on a donkey?
Would the stones cry out in delight over the joy and freedom of this moment?
You and I, we know what it's like to get a glimpse of God's dream for the world.
We feel gratitude for community, for sharing a common purpose. Hosanna!
If they keep quiet.
Even the stones will cry out. But the stones can't shout, can they?
But if they could, what would they shout?
Would they shout in protest?
Would they shout for the raising up of a new king, knowing that a new king means the bringing down of the current one?
This would be treason to the ears of those in power.
On one end of town, Pilate was processing into Jerusalem, surrounded by troops and armor and weaponry.
Across town, Jesus was riding on a colt.
It's a real people's movement.
And the Pharisees knew what would happen when crowds gathered, shouting and proclaiming a new king.
They knew what the powers would do.
You and I, we know what the powers can do. We know how power reacts to a peaceful protest.
Don't provoke. Don't come in here shouting, carrying your signs. The time isn't right.
Can you hear the words of Martin Luther King Jr. from his cell in Birmingham? "I have come to Birmingham because injustice is here. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The time is always ripe to do right."
If they keep quiet,
Even the stones will cry out.
But stones can't shout, can they?
But if they could, what would they shout?
Would they shout lament?
Because that's what Jesus does.
Suddenly, Jesus turns the corner and sees Jerusalem before him.
He cries out in lament, "O Jerusalem, if you, even you, had known on this day what would bring you peace."
Jesus sees the destruction and the violence that comes with unjust power.
Jesus cries out and weeps for Jerusalem and for all the people.
He knows what will happen in the days to come, and even beyond that.
You and I, we can imagine this destruction, for we have seen it in Ukraine, in the Mideast, and in our streets.
If you could somehow silence this crowd,
Even the stones will shout.
But stones can't shout, can they?
But if they could, what would they shout?
What will you shout?
What in this moment that can't be silenced?
What must be said?
What is bubbling up in you that needs to be voiced?
Praise, protest, lament.
If you could somehow silence this crowd.
Even the stones will cry out. So, let us all cry out.
Justice.
kindness,
Mercy.
Forgiveness.
Compassion.
Love.
Life.
Silence no more.
Well, thank you, choir and Leanda and Reader's Choir, Nancy. proclaimers all. He rode it on a young donkey. We call it the triumphal entry, but one so different from the triumphalism of our world that we stop this day to remember and take notice. When Julius Caesar entered Rome after the Battle of Carthage, so the historian Suetonius records, there were 10,000 horses, 5,000 elephants, 100,000 armed soldiers, and that was just the start. The parade took 5 days and 5 nights to wend its way through the city. The would-be Caesars of the world love military parades. How different this day was at the beginning of this horrid and holy week. Jesus came riding in a young donkey. He had staged it. Yes, staged it, as prophets often stage their acted-out prophecies. And this one was staged as a acted-out parable. It was staged as the fulfillment of Zechariah's words. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming to you, humble, riding on a donkey, and he shall command peace to the nations. A king, yes, but not on a war stallion, on a lowly donkey. A servant king on the way of peace. Still he comes, and still we miss him. Our eyes are trained on the spectacular and the powerful. Roland Burhans was the pastor at Crescent Hill Baptist Church in Louisville in the 1950s, about 20 years before I showed up there. He told me of the day he and his wife, Mrs. Burhans, went to Washington, D.C. for a tourist visit. They went to the White House. They wanted to see the White House. And as they stepped up toward the White House, they saw a big crowd gathered along, and they saw a big black long limousine pull up, and they looked through the shoulders of the crowd to see what foreign dignitary was going to come through. All they saw was a older young woman who came out of the limousine. They were a little disappointed. They went on to the other places in D.C. they wanted to see and came back to Louisville. The next morning, Mrs. Burhans was reading the newspaper and saw the photo on the front of the newspaper. Look, she said, it was Helen Keller. It's easy to miss Jesus some days. We're looking for the glitter, the power, the wealth. Luke says that a multitude of disciples were following Jesus into Jerusalem and began to shout their praise, as you've heard today so beautifully. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace. Well, who were these multitudes of disciples? Crowds had begun to follow Jesus in Jericho the day before. They had followed Jesus to Jericho, and in Jericho he healed blind Bartimaeus, and then a bigger crowd began to follow him, including Bartimaeus. He was a ragtag group of followers who began in Galilee and had come all the way with him and grown into a group the size which caused the watchers to be afraid. Look at them for a moment, this crowd. Jesus was the king of fishermen and tax collectors and harlots and well-known sinners, the king of the blind and the crippled, set free from their infirmity, the king of the bent-over woman and the banished lepers who were healed and brought back into the people of God, women like the Samaritan woman, wrong race, wrong gender, wrong religion, now a speaker for Jesus. And there were the 12, of course, and also women disciples, which Luke identified at the beginning of Luke chapter 8. Mary Magdalene was one, yes, of course. Joanna, yes, and Susanna, who was the wife of Herod's steward. Herod, who wanted Jesus dead. Now, how did that happen? And then there were more women, Luke said, who followed and helped him out of their means. And then later this week of Holy Week, he describes the whole crowd of women who came from Galilee with him, who stayed with him to the end. When the male disciples fled and forsook him, the women there stood with him to the very end. All of these were those who were shouting that day their exuberant praise. We are them, they are us. You didn't have to be here today. Luke tells us that they laid their garments on the road before him. Not the tuxedo jackets and expensive wraps of the VIPs, but the well-worn cloaks, the fraying scarves. And then they cut down the palm branches and gave them around so they could all wave the palms like children at a parade. It was a wild and glorious day. The King of Peace had come to his people. Jesus didn't need a parade to validate his credentials. They needed a parade to kindle their hope. And hope came on a young donkey. But then a dark cloud appeared, raining on the parade, so to speak. Tell your disciples to shut up. They wanted this praise, all this praise stifled. Perhaps they were worried that this holy ruckus would spark a holy campaign against Rome, and Rome would bring down its full wrath on the people, unsettle the status quo of the collusion between the leaders of the nation and Rome. So Jesus' words then have rung in my ears for decades, since the first time I heard them. If these be silent, the very stones of the earth will cry out. And so it's been for all these 2,000 years, often from the fringes of the church, not the safe, secure center, often from the fringes of belief itself. If these be quiet, the stones of the earth will cry it out. John the Baptist faced opposition from the religious insiders and leaders who claimed ownership of Abraham and the tribe. And he said to them, "Do not presume to say to yourself, 'We have Abraham as our father,' for I say to you, from these stones God is able to raise up children to Abraham." And lo and behold, it began to happen. There was Saul breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord on his way to Antioch on the road to Damascus. And the risen Christ appeared to him, knocking him off his high horse and with blinding light and amazing grace. And before it was all over, he had called Saul, now Paul, to be his apostle to the Gentiles. A stone had moved from his heart, and Paul never stopped his praise. And there was Lydia, a successful dealer in purple cloth. Paul spoke Jesus to her, and her home became the house church for the new Christians in Philippi. And there was Rhoda, the housekeeper, who signed up, and Phoebe, the deacon of the church at Rome. Paul spoke of this motley crew of early members of the church, the dispossessed, the slaves, the women, with these words: "God has made us the last act in the show. a spectacle to the wise, but we are glad fools for Christ. In the Middle Ages, there were the women mystics who dared speak the gospel from the margins of the institutional church. Christ appeared to them, women without credentials and visions, like Catherine of Siena in Italy and Teresa of Avila in Spain and Hildegard of Bingen in Germany. Let me tell you about Hildegard. As a girl, she had visions. After years of tussle with the male church officials, she became the abbess of a monastery of nuns. She was a healing physician, practicing medieval medicine in brand new ways using natural herbs and helps. She was a musician who wrote songs that we still sing today. She was a theologian. She was a reformer. She pestered the Pope with letters. She called herself a small trumpet, a feather on the breath of God. If these be quiet, the very stones will cry out. There was Francis, a young man, father of a wealthy Italian businessman who protected him from the harshest of conditions of life. But one day he left his opulent home and saw the poor, and Christ said to him, "Renew my church." And he gave up his wealth. He became an apostle of peace. Preach the gospel everywhere, he said, and then added, if necessary, use words. There are many ways to cry out the gospel, sometimes without words. There was Sojourner Truth, the freed slave who fought for the emancipation of slaves and the abolition of slavery and the emancipation of women. It began when Christ appeared to her one time, and this is what she said: I both know you and don't know you. I've never heard such an honest, authentic response to an appearance of Christ. There was a Quaker named John Woolman who went from Quaker meeting to Quaker meeting, from Quaker home to Quaker home, to convince them to give up their slaves. He wore only white, undyed suits because dyes came from slave labor. If these be silent, the very stones will cry out. I go on to our time and to India. There was a young man named Gandhi. He had read the novels of Leo Tolstoy and his writings and discovered that Tolstoy was changed by the reading of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. So he read it and was convinced of the way of nonviolence as a way of social change. His nonviolent protest in India changed that nation. He said one time he would have become a Christian except for the Christians. There was a young man named Bayard Ruskin who was converted to nonviolent social change by Gandhi. This is how it works. He brought his convictions to the home of Martin Luther King one night when terrible violence had been threatened against King's life and his family's life in his house. King had a pistol in his home, and Ruskin went to him and said, "Put away that pistol," and convinced him more about the way of nonviolence. We don't know much about Ruskin because he was a gay black man, and he then took a back seat. He planned the whole march on Washington, but he took a less conspicuous seat not to be a distraction. And how can we forget Fannie Lou Hamer, another unsung hero of the civil rights movement and mighty woman. She was a leader in the drive for voter registration, which was very dangerous at that time. And in 1963, she and her friends were arrested in a bus stop sitting in whites only section. She was put in jail and beaten so savagely that her body never fully recovered. She'd be part of the civil rights crowd in a particular event, and when things got scary and hard, she would start singing, "This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine," and soon everybody started singing it with her. If these be silent, the very stones will cry out and sing out. Have you noticed how often that God has raised up disciples from the most unlikely of places and people? Martin Luther King said that the vitality of religion is almost always at the fringes, not at the easy center. The true church, then, is always a moral minority. There was a young woman living in New York City. Her name was Frances Perkins, who witnessed one day the horror of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, where 146 of the women working there all died and were trapped in the fires. Her life was changed. She became an advocate for the labor movement. She became the Secretary of Labor in the FDR administration for 12 years, the longest of any cabinet member she served. And she helped FDR create social legislation which has made us a better nation, and including the Social Security Act. We need a new Frances Perkins today. She might be in this room. She's all around. If these be silent, the very stones of the earth will cry out. Nature bears witness too. Have you observed it? You cut down a tree, there's the stump, and what starts happening? Sprouts. New little trees start coming up. The church is that stump. Look at the stones and bricks of this modest church house we have, all the stories that have been told. After the procession into Jerusalem, Jesus went to the city and wept. Would that even today you know the way that makes for peace? You did not know, but they are hid from your eyes, he said. You did not know the day of your visitation. It's easy to miss him and his way of peace. We want quicker, easier solutions than the hard work and long way of peace. Violence is quicker. Peace is in for the long haul. But it's the way of God. It's been the way of God all along. It's the way of God through Jesus and his whole life from manger to Palm Sunday to the cross to Easter. If these be quiet, the very stones will cry out. There's a contemporary poet laureate named Richard Wilbur, who wrote a poem that links Jesus' birth to Palm Sunday to Easter. It's been put to music. Hear his words. I mean, here's a truth that won't have his mouth shut. Here's a song that will be sung. So hear his words. The name of the poem is "A Stable Lamp is Lighted." A stable lamp is lighted, whose glow shall reach the sky. The stars shall bend their voices, and every stone shall cry, and every stone shall cry like straw, and straw like gold will shine. A barn will harbor heaven, a stall become a shrine. This child through David's city shall ride in triumph by. The palm shall strew its branches, and every stone shall cry. And every stone shall cry, though heavy, dull, and dumb, and lie within the roadway to pave his kingdom come. Yet shall he be forsaken and yielded up to die. The sky shall groan and darken, and every stone shall cry, and every stone shall cry, for hearts made hard by sin. God's blood upon the spearhead, God's love refused again. And now the last verse. But now, as at the ending, the low is lifted high. The stars shall bend their voices, and every stone shall cry, and every stone shall cry in praises of the child, by whose descent among us the worlds are reconciled. Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Joy to the world. The Lord is come.